dangerous men lying under oath, mothers collapsing when verdicts were read aloud, people walking into my courtroom believing justice was something they could purchase, bend, or intimidate into submission. I have witnessed all of it across the years I have spent on this bench, but nothing in those decades prepared me for the morning an 82-year-old veteran rolled up his sleeve and made every person in that room forget how to breathe. His name was Harold Bennett. When he entered, nobody looked twice. He moved slowly, one hand on a wooden cane, the other holding a folder so worn its corners had begun to curl. His suit was old but clean. His shoes were polished with the specific discipline that appears only in men who spent their lives honoring rules, uniforms, and country. Across from him sat a woman named Vanessa Cole. She was younger, polished, composed in a way that caught my attention from the moment she settled into her chair. Not nervous, not emotionally affected, not even remotely uncomfortable. She sat there as though this case had already concluded in her favor before it had properly begun. That variety of confidence in my courtroom always causes me to look more carefully. The case appeared straightforward at first. Harold claimed that Vanessa had taken thousands of dollars from him after promising to help repair his home. She claimed he was confused, forgetful, and angry because he had misunderstood their arrangement. That was her strategy. Establish the old man as unreliable, make him appear unstable, introduce doubt about his memory before he opened his mouth. I have encountered that approach many times. When someone cannot destroy the truth, they attempt to destroy the person carrying it. Harold sat without reaction while Vanessa's attorney spoke. He never interrupted, never shook his head, never created a scene. He kept both hands folded over that folder, his thumb moving slowly along its edge, as though he were holding on to something considerably heavier than paper. Then Vanessa looked at him and smiled, not warmly, a small, controlled smile of the variety people produce when they believe they are beyond reach. That was the first moment I felt something shift in the room. I asked Harold to explain what had happened. He rose slowly, and the courtroom went quiet. His voice was rough but controlled. He told me he had served in Vietnam. He told me his wife Eleanor had died 2 years earlier. He told me the roof of the house they had shared for 49 years had developed a leak above their bedroom. Then he said Vanessa had appeared at his door offering assistance. She told me veterans deserved better, Your Honor. When he said those words, Vanessa looked down, only for a single second. But I saw it. Judges are trained to listen to testimony, but after sufficient time on this bench, you learn that bodies confess before mouths do. I leaned forward because this had stopped being simply a story about a bad repair job. This had become a question of why a calm and intelligent woman would target an 82-year-old veteran, and why Harold Bennett had walked into my courtroom holding a folder he seemed almost afraid to open. I asked him one direct question. Mr. Bennett, what evidence do you have? He looked at me, then at Vanessa, and for the first time that morning, his hands began to tremble. He opened the folder with great care, and I remember noticing how deliberate he was with every page. Not because the documents were physically fragile, but because the truth they contained had cost him something to keep. He placed 3 items on the table: a handwritten contract, a bank withdrawal slip, and a photograph of his home. The photograph showed a small white house with a sagging porch, cracked steps, and an American flag hanging beside the front door. It was not a mansion. It held no significant financial value in the way banks calculate these things, but I could see it meant everything to him. Harold looked at that photograph longer than he looked at anyone else in the room. That was Eleanor's house, he said. She planted those roses herself. Vanessa's attorney immediately objected, arguing that emotion had no bearing on the contractual matter before the court. The legal point was technically valid, but I also understood something operating at a different level entirely. In a courtroom, money is rarely only money. Sometimes it is trust. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is the last remaining piece of dignity a person has left to protect. I allowed Harold to continue. He explained that Vanessa had introduced herself as the director of a veteran assistance organization called Home Honor Outreach. She told him her group repaired homes for elderly veterans at reduced rates. She brought printed brochures. She had a functioning website. She wore a badge. Everything carried the appearance of legitimacy. That is precisely how manipulation operates. It does not arrive wearing anything recognizable as a threat. It arrives smiling, organized, professionally prepared, and saying the exact words a lonely person has been needing to hear. Harold said he gave her $8,700, his savings, money he had been holding for medical expenses and winter maintenance. Vanessa's position was that the payment had been a charitable donation, not a construction deposit. In her telling, Harold had willingly supported her organization and then became angry when he discovered that donations were non-refundable. Her voice carried that claim with a steadiness that was almost too deliberate. I watched Harold while she spoke. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. That told me something important. People lying under pressure tend to overreact when they are challenged. People telling a painful truth often go quiet because what they are carrying is already too heavy to add anything to. Then Vanessa's attorney stood and began examining Harold on his age. Had he ever forgotten appointments? Did he take medication? Had he confused dates before? Had members of his family ever raised concerns about his memory? Each question arrived wrapped in courtesy, but I understood exactly what was being constructed. He was not investigating facts. He was attempting to reduce Harold from a credible witness to a fragile, elderly man whose account no one could trust. Harold answered every question with quiet steadiness. Then the attorney asked whether it was possible that Harold had simply misunderstood what Ms. Cole had communicated to him. The courtroom went still. Harold looked down at his hands. That was when I noticed something. The sleeves of his shirt were buttoned tight and pulled low, almost deliberately positioned to keep his wrists covered. Initially, I thought nothing of it. Many older men dress formally when they appear in court. But Harold kept touching his cuffs each time Vanessa spoke, as though something beneath the fabric was making itself felt through the cloth. I asked whether there was any further evidence he wanted to present. He hesitated. Then he said quietly, "There is one more thing, Your Honor." Vanessa's smile disappeared in an instant. I have come to understand that fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits in a courtroom in an old suit, holding a worn folder, and asks for permission to tell the truth. Harold looked at me as though he wanted very much to speak, but something inside him was still fighting against it. His eyes moved toward Vanessa, then toward the people seated in the gallery behind her. A group from her organization had accompanied her that day. They sat together in the second row, dressed professionally, speaking in quiet murmurs as though they were attending a business function rather than a hearing. That bothered me. Harold was alone. No family beside him, no attorney, no one whose presence communicated that someone in his life had his back. Just one elderly veteran standing before this court, trying to establish that he had not been deceived by a woman half his age. I asked him again, "Mr. Bennett, what is the additional evidence?" He swallowed. "May I show the court something?" Vanessa's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, we object unless this material has been properly disclosed." I looked at him and said, "Sit down. I decide what this court sees." The room went silent. Harold did not move at first. Then slowly, with fingers that were visibly shaking, he began unbuttoning his left cuff. At that moment, Vanessa leaned forward, just slightly, but I registered it. The composure she had maintained throughout the morning was beginning to fracture. Every person in the room sensed that we had arrived at the edge of something considerably darker than a contract disagreement. Harold rolled the sleeve only partway up his arm. Then he stopped. His voice dropped. "She told me not to show anyone." Listen carefully to that sentence because it changed the entire atmosphere of the room. She told me not to show anyone. Not I forgot. Not I was confused. Not I misunderstood. That was not the language of a man with a failing memory. That was the language of someone who had been threatened. I asked him who had told him that. His eyes moved toward Vanessa. She forced a brief laugh. I have observed guilty people laugh before. It never sounds quite as natural as they intend. Genuine laughter releases something. Manufactured laughter attempts to manage something. Harold rolled his sleeve higher. The first thing visible was bruising. Old bruising, the yellow and purple marks that form when pressure has been applied with sufficient force. The marks ran along his forearm in a pattern shaped like fingers. The courtroom drew a collective breath. But that was not what held me, because beneath those bruises were words written in faded black marker across his skin. A date, a time, and a name. Vanessa Cole. Tuesday, 9:14 in the evening. For a moment, no one spoke. Not the attorneys, not Vanessa. I looked at Harold Bennett's arm and felt that cold weight that judges learn over many years to conceal from everyone else. The feeling that tells you a case has crossed a threshold it cannot step back from. I asked Harold why he had written those words on his own arm. He looked embarrassed, not angry, not performing anything for the room. Embarrassed. That broke something in me. People who have been manipulated and controlled often carry shame for having survived what was done to them. He said, because I was afraid I would forget. The courtroom went completely still. Then he explained that after Vanessa had taken his money, he had called her office repeatedly. At first, she had been cordial. Then she stopped answering. Then one night, she came to his house. That night was the date written on his arm. He said she told him that if he pursued this in court, people would conclude he was losing his mind. She told him no one would believe an elderly man who lived alone. She told him she had documentation, witnesses, and legal representation on her side. Then Harold paused. His eyes filled, but his voice did not break. She grabbed my arm when I tried to close the door. I looked at Vanessa. The smile was gone. Her attorney was whispering rapidly into her ear, but her eyes remained fixed on Harold's sleeve, as though she believed she could undo the evidence by staring at it hard enough. I asked Harold whether he had reported the incident to anyone. He shook his head. No, Your Honor. I was ashamed. That answer reached me more than any legal argument presented in that room. I ordered a brief recess, and before leaving the bench, I instructed the bailiff to preserve the courtroom recording and directed my clerk to verify the registration status of Home Honor Outreach immediately. When we returned, everything had shifted. The clerk placed a printed document before me. The charity registration number printed on Vanessa's brochures belonged to an entirely different nonprofit organization located in Ohio. The website had been created only 5 months before Harold first encountered her. The address listed for the charity was a rented mailbox. And then came the detail that settled heavily in my chest. Harold was not the only elderly veteran who had paid Vanessa. There were 6 others, all widowers, all over 75, all living alone. That was when the full shape of what I was looking at became clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a designed system. Vanessa had not simply taken money from Harold Bennett. She had studied loneliness, grief, age, patriotism, and pride, and she had converted all of those things into a method of extracting money. I looked at her and asked one question. Ms. Cole, how many veterans did you visit after their spouses had died? For the first time in the entire proceeding, she had no response. She sat looking at me with the expression of someone calculating whether silence would provide adequate protection. It would not. The courtroom monitor displayed materials my clerk had recovered. Archive captures from Vanessa's website, payment records, photographs she had used to market her charity. In every image, Vanessa stood beside elderly veterans, one hand on their shoulder, positioning herself as someone who had come to help. Then we reached the video. A neighbor's doorbell camera had recorded the night Vanessa came to Harold's home. The footage was grainy but sufficiently clear. There she was at his porch at 9:14 in the evening, the precise time written on his arm. Vanessa knocked. Harold opened the door. She moved forward, too close, using the physical language of someone accustomed to controlling an encounter with a person who is afraid of making a scene. Then her voice came through the recording. If you go to court, Harold, I will make sure they know you are losing your mind. A woman in the gallery made a sound. Harold looked at the floor. Vanessa's attorney stopped writing. The video then showed Harold attempting to close his door. Vanessa reached out and seized his arm in the precise location where the bruising was visible. And in that moment, Harold's hand moved into his shirt pocket. He produced a marker and began writing on his own skin while she continued shouting at him. That was the moment the room broke open. Voices began rising across the gallery. The bailiff moved closer to Vanessa's table, and Harold simply stood there with tears on his face, not because he wanted anyone's sympathy, but because for the first time since this had begun, the people in that room could see what he had been carrying without anyone beside him. Vanessa said the video was being taken out of context. I looked at her and said that there was no innocent context for threatening an elderly man on his porch at night. Then the final piece appeared, a spreadsheet recovered from Vanessa's email account. It contained names, ages, addresses, military branch, and marital status of elderly veterans. Next to Harold's name was a single word, recent widow. That was the moment I had to work hardest to maintain my composure, because this woman had not found her victims by chance or proximity. She had cataloged grief. She had ranked vulnerability. She had transformed the deaths of wives into a list of business prospects. And Harold Bennett, the quiet old man whom everyone in that room had been prepared to dismiss as confused and unreliable, had preserved the one piece of evidence she had never anticipated, his own arm. I looked at Vanessa, and the confidence was no longer simply diminished. It was entirely absent. The courtroom had seen the truth, and justice was no longer waiting at some theoretical distance. It was present in that room, directly in front of her. I ordered Vanessa Cole to remain in the courtroom. Her attorney stood immediately, but the certainty that had been in his voice at the start of the morning was gone. He understood what everyone understood. This case had moved well beyond a civil damages claim. What was in front of the court was fraud, intimidation, elder abuse, and a pattern of conduct that had reached at least 7 men who were too ashamed, too isolated, or too frightened to seek help on their own. I awarded Harold Bennett the full amount he had lost, and I added punitive damages beyond that. But money was not the moment that remained with me after the day was finished. The moment that stayed was what happened after the bailiff escorted Vanessa out for further investigation. Harold remained standing, still holding his rolled sleeve in one trembling hand. The entire courtroom looked at him differently now, not as a confused elderly man, not as a victim seeking sympathy, as a witness who had refused to allow fear to erase what he knew to be true. I asked whether he wanted to say anything. He looked toward the empty chair where Vanessa had been sitting. Then he said, "My wife always told me to write things down if they mattered." That sentence reached every person in that room more completely than any verdict I could have delivered. Because in the end, Eleanor had still been protecting him, not through money or attorneys, but through one small habit of love. Write down what matters. And Harold had done exactly that. He had written the truth on his own skin when no one else was present to record it or to believe him. I have presided over many cases across many years. That one changed permanently the way I understand silence. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is an old soldier gathering what remains of his courage in order to show the room his wound. Remember this: predators do not always attack with force. Sometimes they arrive with paperwork, manufactured warmth, fraudulent organizations, and confident smiles. They look for people who live alone, people who grieve without making a sound, people who still believe that a handshake carries the weight of a promise. But justice has a way of finding the small details that predators overlook: an unsteady handwriting on a contract, a neighbor's camera positioned at the right angle, a date and a name written in marker on an old man's arm, and the courage of one 82-year-old veteran who came into my courtroom carrying nothing except a worn folder, a wooden cane, and the truth. Vanessa Cole believed Harold Bennett was too old to be taken seriously. She was wrong. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue threats. He simply rolled up his sleeve, and what was written there spoke more clearly than anything else in that courtroom.